Katherine was 70 years old and lived alone in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the forest. The trees had become her only company after her husband passed nearly a decade ago. She moved through her days quietly, feeding the birds, tending her garden, and keeping the same steady routine that kept the loneliness away. The forest, with all its sounds and moods, felt like an old friend. That evening, rain fell steady and cold. Katherine sat near the window with a cup of tea, watching the mist roll between the pines. The wind carried strange noises sometimes, branches creaking, owls calling. But this sound was different. It was soft, broken, almost like crying. She put on her old shawl and stepped onto the porch. The rain was heavier now, tapping against the roof in restless rhythm. Then she saw it, something small curled near the steps, shivering beneath a wet cloth. At first she thought it was a lost animal. But when it lifted its face, her heart stopped. The eyes were wide and amber, filled with fear and confusion. The small body was covered in fine brown fur, matted by rain. It wasn't human, but it wasn't something she could turn away from either. Katherine whispered almost to herself, "Oh, you poor thing." She bent down, wrapped it in her quilt, and carried it inside. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Inside the small cabin, the storm pressed hard against the windows. Katherine laid the creature on a folded blanket near the fire. Steam rose from its wet fur as the warmth began to reach it. The little thing was frightened, its chest rising fast, small hands clutching the edge of the quilt like it might vanish at any second. Katherine knelt beside it, studying its face. Its nose was small, its lips trembling, and its fur soft and fine like that of a young animal. But its eyes were unmistakably expressive. Those amber eyes searched hers not with wildness, but with a quiet plea for safety. "I don't know what you are," she murmured, "but you're not staying out there tonight." She warmed milk on the stove and offered it with a spoon. The creature hesitated, sniffed, then began to drink, slowly at first, then hungrily. Its tiny fingers brushed her wrist and something inside her softened. The cabin felt smaller, quieter, as if time itself had paused to watch this fragile moment. When it was done, she cleaned the mud from its fur, careful not to startle it. The creature gave a soft sound, half sigh, half coo, and leaned into her palm. Katherine smiled faintly, feeling something she hadn't in years: purpose. Thunder rumbled outside as she wrapped it tighter in the quilt. Its breathing slowed, and soon it was asleep by the fire. Katherine sat back in her chair, listening to the rain and watching the tiny life she'd just brought in from the cold. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight the storm could rage all it wanted. Inside, the cabin was warm and she wasn't alone anymore. The storm passed by morning, leaving the forest soaked and still. Mist clung to the trees, and the smell of wet pine drifted through the cracks of the old cabin. Katherine hadn't slept. She'd spent the whole night listening to the small creature's breathing, afraid it might stop. By sunrise, it stirred under the blanket, blinking up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. She smiled softly. "Good morning, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly from the long night. The creature tilted its head, studying her like it understood. Over the next few days, a quiet rhythm formed. Katherine warmed milk, mashed berries, and made a small cradle out of a wicker basket she found in the attic. The creature, she had started calling it Eli after her late husband, grew stronger each day. It began following her movements, reaching for her hands, mimicking small gestures. When she hummed old songs while washing dishes, Eli would sway gently in rhythm. When she sat by the fire reading aloud, it would curl up beside her, clutching the edge of her sleeve like a child afraid of losing touch. At first, she told herself this was just temporary, that once the weather cleared, she'd find someone who could help, maybe the ranger or the sheriff, but deep down she knew no one would understand. Not about the footprints she saw outside the porch every morning, not about the way the forest seemed quieter now, like something was keeping watch. Each evening she stepped outside with Eli in her arms. The woods looked peaceful, but Katherine always felt a presence beyond the trees. Gentle, patient, waiting. Still, she whispered to the mist, "Don't worry, I'll take care of him." And though no voice ever answered, she sometimes heard the faintest echo, a low, distant hum carried by the wind, like a reply only a mother could understand. By the third morning, The forest had returned to its quiet rhythm. Dew clung to the grass and a pale fog drifted low across the meadow behind the cabin. Katherine stepped outside early, her shawl tight around her shoulders, a steaming mug in one hand. The world looked peaceful again, almost ordinary, until she saw them. Footprints. They started near the garden fence, pressed deep into the soft earth where the rain had turned the soil loose. At first she thought it was a bear, but when she bent down and looked closer, her breath caught. Each print was bare, wide, flat, and at least twice the size of her own foot. Her eyes followed the trail as it moved around the garden, past the old oak tree, and stopped near the porch steps. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had come right up to the cabin. She turned toward the window where Eli sat in his cradle by the fire. He was awake, staring out toward her as if he sensed something too. Katherine's heart beat faster, but not from fear. There was something deliberate about those prints, careful, cautious, almost protective. It didn't feel like a threat. Later that morning, she carried Eli outside, wrapped in a soft towel. The wind brushed through the pines, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. She stood there quietly, letting him see the world. His small eyes followed a crow passing overhead, and for the first time she saw a spark of wonder. Behind them, in the line of trees, something shifted. A shadow, large and still. She didn't move. She didn't call out. She just knew. The feeling washed over her like warmth. Whoever had left Eli here hadn't abandoned him. They had trusted her. She whispered softly into the morning air, "He's safe. You don't need to worry." The forest gave no answer. But as she turned to go back inside, she saw a single flower, a white trillium lying on the porch rail. Fresh, perfect, and placed there gently. Katherine looked toward the woods one last time, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt it deep down. She wasn't raising this child alone. That night, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper. The forest, usually calm, seemed restless. Branches swaying, the sound of distant movement echoing faintly beyond the ridge. Katherine sat by the window, the lamp low, her knitting untouched in her lap. Eli slept soundly in the cradle, his small chest rising and falling to the rhythm of the crackling fire. But she felt it again. That same quiet presence she couldn't explain. The sense of being watched, not with malice but with purpose. She rose and went to the porch, wrapping her shawl tight around her. The moonlight spilled faintly across the clearing, lighting the garden and the dark line of pines beyond. At first, everything looked still. Then her eyes caught movement, a shape between two trees, tall, broad-shouldered, motionless. Her heart hammered, but she didn't move. The figure didn't either. It simply stood there, half shadow, half moonlight, watching the cabin. Even from that distance, she could sense its calm, its patience. The fear she expected to feel never came. Instead, something else took its place. Understanding. She whispered into the dark. "You can see him, can't you?" "He's doing all right." No answer. Only the faint rustle of leaves. Then slowly the shape stepped back into the trees and disappeared without a sound. Katherine stood there for a long while, the night air cold against her face. When she finally turned to go back inside, Eli stirred in his sleep. A soft murmur as if dreaming of something familiar. She brushed his tiny hand with her fingers and smiled faintly. "Someone's looking out for you," she said, "maybe for both of us." Outside, the forest had gone still again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt watched over, and from that night on, every time the wind brushed through the pines, Katherine felt less alone, as though the woods themselves were breathing quietly around her, keeping her promise safe. By the end of summer, Eli had grown stronger. His dark fur had thickened, his small hands steady when he reached for her face. He laughed now, a low, soft sound that filled the cabin with warmth. Katherine had long stopped wondering what he was. To her, he was simply her boy. But one morning, the mist rolled in heavy and strange. It came not from the hills, but from the forest itself, thick, white, and unnaturally quiet. The birds didn't sing. Even the wind had stilled. Katherine stepped out onto the porch, holding Eli close against her chest. Her breath hung in the cold air. Then through the fog she saw it, movement at the edge of the clearing. A shape emerged. Then another, Two figures, large, shadowed, walking slow but sure. The ground trembled faintly beneath each step. Katherine froze. Her first thought wasn't fear, it was recognition. The tall one, broader than any man, moved with careful grace. The smaller, thinner, followed close behind. Eli began to stir, making that same soft sound she'd heard before he smiled. His tiny hands reached out toward the mist. The figures stopped several yards away. The larger one lifted its head and Katherine saw the eyes, deep amber reflecting the faint light like old glass. Not wild, not cruel, only full of something she hadn't expected to see. Sorrow. She knew then. These weren't strangers. They were his kind. His family. Her throat tightened. She whispered, "You came back for him." The tall figure gave a low, trembling sound. Not a growl, not a threat. It was grief and love in the same breath. Katherine felt tears rise. She looked down at Eli, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Go on, little one." The mist swallowed them all in silence, and when it cleared, the porch was empty. The years slipped by like the slow turning of seasons. The garden Katherine once tended with such care grew wild again, flowers spreading in places they never had before. The fence half fallen, the old rocking chair faded from sun and rain. Her hair had gone completely white now, her hands thin and trembling, but her eyes still held that same quiet spark. Most folks in town barely remembered the story anymore. When someone mentioned the old woman who claimed she raised a Bigfoot, it was with a laugh or a shake of the head. Katherine never argued. She had long stopped trying to convince anyone. Every morning she sat by her window with a cup of tea watching the tree line. The forest was her only company now. On the sill beside her cup sat a small wooden carving, a rough figure of a small creature with gentle eyes. She had carved it herself from an old pine branch the year after Eli was taken. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, when the wind fell quiet and the air grew still, she thought she heard something. A faint rustle in the brush, the crack of a branch, footsteps, slow, careful, stopping near the porch, never coming closer. She'd smile softly and whisper toward the trees. "You still visit me, don't you?" The sound would stop for a moment as if listening, then fade away into the woods. Katherine never felt afraid. In those quiet moments, she didn't feel lonely either. The world had moved on, but the bond she'd shared with that lost child, and with the creature that had loved it, had never really ended. Love, she thought, doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. And somewhere out there, the forest remembered her name. It was early morning, the kind where the mist moves slow and the world feels half asleep. Katherine woke to a soft thud on her porch. Her heart fluttered in that sound, that familiar hush before dawn. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and opened the creaking door. There, standing just beyond the fog, was a figure, massive yet calm. Broad shoulders, silver streaks in deep brown fur, and those same amber eyes that once looked up at her from a blanket by the fire. Willow. He stood motionless, breathing slow, the mist curling around him like smoke. Then with deliberate care, he placed something on the porch floor, a small time-worn wooden rattle. The very one she had carved for him decades ago. Katherine's frail hands shook as she reached out, her eyes wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. "You remembered," she whispered. Willow bowed his head, a silent goodbye, and turned back toward the forest. Within moments, the mist swallowed him whole. That night, Katherine opened her old journal. Her writing was uneven now, but steady enough to finish one last line. "They said I was crazy, but I raised love from the wild, and love found its way home." She passed peacefully a few days later, the rattle still in her hand. When spring came, neighbors noticed wildflowers blooming all across her porch, bright, untamed, and growing where no roots had ever taken before, as if the forest itself was saying thank you.